All right, so we are live, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And of course, there are no classrooms right now. All of you guys are stuck at home, so we really appreciate you tuning in on YouTube as we continue to highlight amazing scientists, explorers, and facilities from around the globe and keep the learning going with you. Today, we continue our epic SciComm Storytime series. So every day at 2 p.m. Eastern or 11 a.m. Pacific, we are featuring an all-star of science communication. We have done neuroscience, we've dove into volcanoes, we've done all sorts of really fantastic things with our speakers in the last week and a half. And today we are joined by Nick Underwood. So he is an aerospace engineer with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and he gets to fly on research planes doing Arctic reconnaissance, flying into the heart of hurricanes to get a better understanding of them, and all the stuff that I wish I could do when I grew up. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Nick, and take us away.
All right, thank you so much. So my name is Nick Underwood. Like he said, I'm an aerospace engineer for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Aircraft Operations Center, which is a long way of saying that I'm a NOAA hurricane hunter. And I'm one of these people that flies on an airplane into hurricanes to gather important scientific data. And today we're going to talk about that mission, how I got such a weird and interesting job, some of the other missions I help support, and my absolute favorite part about my job. So I was born and raised in West Virginia, and at a young age, I figured out that I wanted to, one, become an astronaut, and two, wanted to work with rockets and airplanes and everything else that flew through the air. I pursued a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering from West Virginia University, go Mountaineers. I then had a short-lived attempt at getting a master's degree, and that didn't really pan out, but I'm back in grad school now at the University of South Florida studying physical oceanography. After leaving West Virginia, I got a job as a flight test engineer with the United States Navy, working at Patuxent River Naval Air Station. This job involved working with strike aircraft like F-18s and F-35s, like the ones you can see behind me here. And while that job was exciting, it wasn't really science focused. And I wanted to do something with my degree that was science focused. So I started looking for jobs at NASA and NOAA. I got offered positions at both, and taking the advice I had gotten from an astronaut a year earlier on how to be an astronaut, I chose the job that got me out from behind a desk, and that was the NOAA job. And so since the fall of 2016, I've chased hurricanes across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. I've spent several weeks.
Oh, you cut out for a second. Sorry. Oh. You were in the midst of saying that you were looking for jobs at NOAA and NASA, and then
all right. You cut out. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
I was looking for jobs at NASA and NOAA. Taking the advice I had gotten from an astronaut a year earlier on how to be an astronaut, I chose the job that got me out from behind a desk, which was the NOAA job. And so since the fall of 2016, I've been chasing hurricanes across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. I've spent several weeks helping to study Arctic sea ice formation and marine mammal surveys. And I've gone to other countries and cities across the United States to talk to people about the missions that NOAA supports and why they're important and how they impact people. So as an aerospace engineer for NOAA, I do still have a desk job, and that involves using the skills that I learned in college, aerodynamics, thermodynamics, structural mechanics, using those skills to support NOAA's fleet of research aircraft, helping to get new science instruments mounted and other things like that. The other part of my job, which is where this flight suit comes into play, is actually serving as aircrew on NOAA's fleet of research aircraft, operating data systems, deploying data gathering scientific instruments. And before we get into talking about what some of these missions are, I want to point out that although this is a SciComm story time, we're not going to talk much about the science side of it, more about the operations and how that scientific data is collected. So we'll pull up my slides here. Whoop. Hang on. Let me get it right. Yeah. Drum roll, please. Exactly. Don't want to spoil it too soon here.
While you're getting ready too, for anyone tuning in on YouTube, just let me know where you're joining from, and I really look forward to questions in the chat bar when we've gotten to that point in the presentation, but let's see if we can get there.
There we go. There we go. That should work. All right. So the first mission I'm going to talk about today is Arctic heat. And so this mission takes place in the Arctic, and it focuses on an area of the Arctic Ocean called the Chukchi Sea, which is between the north coast of Alaska and Russia. This area has seen a lot of sea ice loss in recent years, and so this project focuses on understanding the physical and biogeochemical processes that are behind that sea ice loss. For this mission, we use a small aircraft called a Twin Otter that's been outfitted for science. It's got atmospheric sensors on it. It's got radiometers that can measure energy from the sun, as well as energy reflected back from the ocean, and a whole host of other scientific instruments. The inside can be pretty cramped because we've just jam-packed it with science instruments and monitors. And if you can see on the left side of the screen, we've even got an extra fuel tank so we can fly around for longer. So it's not the most comfortable aircraft to fly around in. You can't even stand up straight. You'd probably be more comfortable in your basic economy seat on your favorite airline. But for this mission, my job is to operate those data systems and deploy expendables into the ocean. The primary expendable that we use is called an airborne expendable bathythermograph. Think of this instrument as a thermometer for the ocean. So as we're flying along at 500 feet above the water, which isn't that high for an aircraft, by the way, we're launching instruments into the ocean through this tube on the bottom. Once they leave the aircraft, they have a parachute that deploys. And as soon as they hit the water, they have a part that stays on the surface with a radio transmitter. And the rest of it descends down through the water column and measures depth, temperature, salt content, all of these parameters that affect whether sea ice can form or not. On a typical mission, we usually launch a handful of these at different spots all throughout the Arctic Ocean just to get as much data as we can. Now, it's easy to launch these when the water beneath you is open, but once you get closer to the sea ice, it gets a little more tricky to launch those instruments because you don't want them to land on the ice, you want them to land in the water. And so we end up having to do these sort of bombing runs on these open areas in the ice. And so this is us launching 2 instruments successfully into a pretty decently large area of open water. And the reason that this data is so important is that as the sea ice continues to recede year over year, a lot of different things are going to happen. One is that shipping lanes that haven't been open will potentially open up, but also Arctic communities that depend on this sea ice for fishing and other activities are going to be greatly impacted. And not just humans, but animals as well are going to have to adapt to this changing environment. So we have another instrument on this aircraft called a forward-looking infrared camera, and we use it to look for marine mammals. Seals are one of them. And so this is a seal pup and its parent that I spotted just this last year. You can see their warm blood pops out very nicely against the cold background. Seals depend on sea ice to stay away from predators in the water like orca whales. And like I said, as sea ice continues to recede, they'll have to learn to adapt to that changing environment. And there's our seal pup friend. We're going to shift gears a little bit from the Arctic to talk about cyclones in the tropics. So the other mission that I help support is hurricane research and reconnaissance. Hurricanes are huge, massive weather systems that impact millions of people each year, and we want to know where they're going. Hurricane research missions focus on how the storms form and how they move, while hurricane reconnaissance missions are focused on where those storms are, where they're going, and how strong they're going to be when they get there. For these missions, NOAA uses 2 different types of aircraft. The first is a Gulfstream 4. So this is a high altitude business jet that we've modified for science. So this flies at 45,000 feet above, around, and in front of the hurricanes to sample the atmosphere that's going to feed into them and also steer where they go. Typically, we don't fly this aircraft directly over the eye of hurricanes because the amount of outflow from the eye tends to be a little too violent and dangerous. But for weaker storms, we will fly directly over the eye sometimes. And so this was the eye of Hurricane Jerry last year, I think when it was a Category 2 storm from 45,000 feet. And this aircraft has radar systems and is able to launch expendables that record atmospheric parameters that we'll talk about more in a minute. The other aircraft that NOAA uses is a Lockheed WP-3D Orion. The Navy used to use P-3s to hunt submarines, and we use them to hunt hurricanes. We have 2 of these aircraft. They're named Kermit and Miss Piggy. And think of these as flying research laboratories. So these are brimming with different scientific instruments. There are 3 radar systems on board, including one in the nose, one in the belly, and one in the tail. There's a pylon on the wing with special laser instruments that can measure water droplets and the makeup of clouds. There's an instrument along the bottom that can look at sea surface states and figure out what the wind speeds are from those. And there are tubes all along the bottom that allow us to launch expendables similar to the ones we saw being launched in the Arctic. A typical crew for this aircraft is about 12 to 15 people, and that includes pilots and navigators who are NOAA Corps officers, meteorologists, scientists, technicians, engineers like myself, everyone working to make sure that we're performing this mission safely above all else and effectively, making sure that we get the data that we need. These airplanes have been chasing storms since the mid-1970s. These are all of the hurricanes that just Kermit has flown through. There are 111 on here, and this doesn't include Hurricane Lorenzo, which was the last one it flew through. And there's also some flags of different countries and states that this aircraft has done scientific research in. And if you look at the bottom left, you can see some of those tubes I was talking about that we can launch instruments out of. On this aircraft, this is where I typically sit. And from this station, I deploy what are called Dropsondes. And those are those instruments that you can see sticking out there. And I'll pull one up here. So this is a GPS Dropsonde. Think of this like a reverse weather balloon. So instead of floating up through the atmosphere and gathering data for us, we launch these out of the bottom of the aircraft. They have a parachute that deploys and slows them down and keeps them stable as they fall. And as they fall down, they give us a profile of the atmosphere at that location. This sensor collects temperature, pressure, and humidity data. A GPS receiver inside allows us to get wind speed and wind direction, and a radio transmitter inside relays all of that data back to the aircraft. So part of my job is quality control, making sure that these instruments are working properly and gathering all of the data that we need. Once they splash in the ocean, we send that data off to the National Hurricane Center so that they can use it in their computer models that predict where these storms are going to go and how strong it's going to be. So those spaghetti plots that you see on TV of the 50 different tracks a storm can take, the data that feeds those models comes from Dropsondes, as well as the other instruments we have on board this aircraft. Now, I do also have a window at that station, which is small, but you can still see some pretty beautiful things out of it. So this is typically what you see, just a lot of gray, wind, and rain. Flying through a hurricane is kind of like being on a wooden roller coaster, but it's also raining outside. So there's a lot of turbulence. There's a lot of bouncing around. We have 5-point harnesses on our seats so that we can stay strapped in and not get bounced around too bad. But once you get through the eye wall, which is the worst part of the storm, you break into the eye, which is clear. It's like being on a commercial flight again. You leave those dark storm clouds behind and you get out into what's really one of the most beautiful things that you can see. This was the eye of Hurricane Irma when it was Category 5 in 2017. This was the eye of Hurricane Dorian just last year when it was Category 3. This was the eye of Hurricane Florence in 2018. Now, we fly these missions between 8,000 to 10,000 feet, and these cloud tops can, depending on your latitude, reach as high as 30, 40, or 50,000 feet. And so we call this view the stadium effect because it looks like you're standing on the field of a football stadium and looking up at all of the stands around you. Now, to get to this viewpoint, you do have to fly through the storm, all of the rain bands, the eye wall, and you have to fly back out. And it takes a while to do that. So this is about 30 to 40 minutes of flight time compressed to 15 seconds. So you can see us passing through all of those rain bands into the eye wall, the worst part of the storm, out into the eye, and then back out the other side. And so that was a flight through Hurricane Florence. And it's important to remember that when you fly into a hurricane, you do have to fly back out. And just to give an example of what that looks like, this is the eye of Hurricane Florence when it was Category 4. You can see it's a beautiful day on the right side and just this wall of water coming at us from the left. And so you go from a nice day to what is really the worst weather that you can possibly imagine. And these videos look very stable because I shot them with a GoPro, which has very good image stabilization, but it is very bumpy. And so this was a video that I shot during Hurricane Irma in 2017. on my phone, just trying to hold it up to the window as steady as I could. And so you can see all of the wind and rain rushing by. We typically fly these missions at 210 knots, which is about 240 miles per hour. And we fly at that speed so that we're flying fast enough that we're not going to stall the aircraft, but slow enough that we're not going to overstress it as we fly through all of these updrafts and downdrafts and violent weather. And in a second, I want to point out why I appreciate structural engineering so much. This science rack is several hundred pounds sitting in front of me, and it is bouncing around just as much as I am. But I know that it's not going to go anywhere, which gives me a little comfort. And so typically when we fly through storms, we'll fly what's called a butterfly pattern, where we'll fly through the eye 3 or 4 times. But depending on how much gas we have, sometimes we'll fly through more than that. So this was a flight through Hurricane Florence, where we flew down from Bermuda, flew 1 pass through the storm, turned, flew a 2nd pass north to south, turned, flew a 3rd pass, and then we had enough gas, and the scientists were interested enough that we flew through the eye 6 more times for a total of 9 on one flight. This was about a 9.5-hour mission. After all of that data gathering, we finally turned south and flew down to St. Croix away from the storm. And it's important to remember that while we're doing all of these flights, they're beautiful to look at, but the data that we're collecting is so very important, both with the jet and with the P3. So the jet, a typical flight path you can see on the left side. This was Hurricane Matthew in 2016, which was actually the very first hurricane I flew through. And I spent 2 hours really enjoying it and then 6 hours being very sick. And so the jet flies around and in front of the storm. Meanwhile, on the right side, you can see a flight path from the P3 making several passes through the eye, gathering all of that data from within the storm. And this data is so very important because, like I said, these storms impact millions of people each year, and we want to know where they're going in advance so that we can warn people to get out of the way. We're pretty good at determining the track of the storm, where it's going to head. Intensity is a little trickier, but we're getting better at it. Part of the problem is a process called rapid intensification. And this is where a storm intensifies very quickly from something that's not very threatening to something of a monster. So this was Tropical Storm Florence on September 8th of 2018. This was that same storm 24 hours later as a Category 1 hurricane. And this is that same storm 24 hours after that as a Category 4 monster. So from this to that in 2 days, that's not a lot of time to prepare, especially if this is coming towards your house. Storms do this all of the time, though. For example, Hurricane Michael in 2018 was a tropical storm on a Sunday and made landfall as a Category 5 hurricane on the following Wednesday. But as we collect more data, those computer models that predict where these storms are going to get better, and we'll be able to warn people earlier. And I want to close with talking about my absolute favorite part of this job. It's not the traveling around to all these different places. It's not the getting to use my degree for something that matters, but it's the perspective that it gives me to consider things in a broader context. The Arctic is beautiful, but it's changing, and the people and organisms that live in that environment are going to have to change with it. Hurricanes are awe-inspiring to behold, but they're deadly, and they can leave entire communities in ruin. And knowing that the work that I do contributes to the science that will lead us to understand these systems better and prepare for them better allows me to empathize and understand people who will be impacted by these systems in the future. And I encourage you to either find a career or find something in your career now that will allow you to also get that kind of perspective, to empathize with other people, and to draw closer. And with that, I want to close it up and we'll open it up for questions. If you did enjoy today's talk, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at @theastronick. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. And we'll put that in the chat bar too for everyone who's tuning in. So at minimum, we've got people from Florida, from Newfoundland, from West Virginia, from Vancouver Island. So we're literally like coast to coast all over Canada and the States here watching in. So again, type in as many questions as you'd like, guys, and I'll pass as many to Nick as we can do today. But let's start with a proud West Virginian, and Emily Calandrelli wanted to ask you, what is the difference between typhoons, hurricanes, and cyclones, Nick?
The difference is really of just where they are. So hurricanes you'll find in the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific, and that's just because the people that live there call them hurricanes. Typhoons you'll find in the Western Pacific because that's what people who live in that region of the world call them. And everywhere else, they don't really have fancy names for them that I know of at least, and they just call them cyclones.
Fantastic. We have another friend of yours. We got all your friends. You did a very good job advertising this. So Ruth Williams wants to know, love the details of your flights to the Arctic. Did you feel nervous the first time because this plane is flying so low? You said 500 feet, which can you give a little context on how low that is? Because it's pretty cool.
It is pretty low. And I would say that understanding the risks involved is something that takes place before we ever get on the aircraft. So we talk a lot about risk management and how to mitigate those risks a lot throughout training for these types of missions and throughout just preparing to fly each day. So before every flight, we do a mission brief with the crew, talking about the objectives that we're going to try to accomplish, what to do in the event of an emergency situation. And so all of that fear tends to be quelled before you ever set foot on the aircraft.
All right. Well, for you anyway. All right, Andrew wants to know, how do hurricanes form? So you show these awesome pictures of a storm becoming a hurricane. How does that happen?
Right. So hurricanes are basically low pressure systems that, because of some fancy math of fluid dynamics and everything, begin to spin up through what's called the Coriolis forcing. And as they suck up energy from the ocean, they get more and more thunderclouds forming, and eventually they can become massive monster storms. Things can get in the way of that formation, such as wind shear, so winds blowing the opposite direction or different directions, causing a misalignment of that center. Also, terrain can get in the way, so mountains like in Cuba tend to break up storms pretty well. But there's a lot of math that goes into understanding the fluid dynamics at play that actually form hurricanes.
Yeah, you bring so many perspectives into understanding this. So I'm curious, in the last like 30 years, we've been flying these missions. We've had more and more research being done in it. How much better are we at predicting where hurricanes are going to go and how powerful they're going to be?
So we certainly have gotten better at it, and we've been flying storms for a long time. Our director of operations has actually been chasing hurricanes since, I believe, the 1960s. So he's been at it a long time. But even just within the last 10 or 15 years or so, what used to be a 3-day forecast is now a 5-day forecast. And that doesn't sound like much time, but that's an extra 48 hours for people to prepare and get out of the way if a storm is coming their way.
Fantastic. All right, again, for everyone tuning in on YouTube, let me know your questions. I know we're ripping through these really fast, so it's hard for you guys to keep up, but please do type in as many as you can. So Cooper wanted to know, how many hurricanes do you chase each year?
Really depends on the season. So for example, 2017 was a very busy year for us because we had Harvey, Irma, and Maria all within the span of a month. I think Hurricane Nate was after that. Usually it ends up being 3, 4, 5 hurricanes, and that's not including storms that are just tropical storms that we still study because they may intensify into hurricanes. To date, I've flown 12 hurricanes, not counting tropical storms, and those are systems both in the Atlantic and the Pacific.
Yeah, so I'm glad we brought that up too. That was my next question. So when there's 3 hurricanes in a month, I mean, what is the deal with this job? Is this something where you're like on call? Okay, there's some epic storm, you're there, there's a research project we want, come up to Northern Alaska. How does it work?
So we set a watch bill. And so we've got enough people to staff all of the airplanes that we have. And if you're not flying, but you're on watch, then you need to be ready to go at a moment's notice. So for example, with Hurricane Irma, it was forming in the deep Atlantic and working its way up. And the forecasts were saying that it was going to be a pretty big storm. And so we forward deployed out to Barbados, as far east in the Caribbean as you can go. And the call for, hey, you're going to Barbados comes pretty quickly. And you have to pack your bags and be ready to go at a moment's notice. And when there's multiple storms, we tend to fly the ones that are going to either provide the most research value if they're not threatening land, or the ones that can potentially cause the most damage. And additionally, we have our aircraft, but the Air Force also has a reserve squadron that they use to chase these systems as well.
Fantastic. So there's backups in case we, don't have any people deployed in the right area and things develop quickly. Cool. All right, we've had 3 other people agree with me and that they want to be you. And so we had a guy come in and ask the question, he missed the beginning of the presentation, just came in, wants to know how you get a job like yours. How did this happen?
So our office employs a variety of different people. I'm an aerospace engineer. We also employ electrical engineers. We hire meteorologists, mechanics, electronics technicians. If you want to be a pilot and actually fly these aircraft, I recommend looking into the NOAA Corps, since all of our pilots are NOAA Corps officers, and they fly all different kinds of NOAA aircraft, from the Twin Otters to the P3s. So really just have an interest either in aviation or in atmospheric or oceanographic science. I would say that's the best way to go about it.
Fantastic. All right, Angela in Schaumburg, Ontario, want to know, what was the debris that was flying around? You are in the eye of the hurricane, you go into the wall, and it looks like there's chunks of stuff. What is that?
So that, if she's talking about the Hurricane Irma video, there's not actually debris there. It's just a dirty window. And at some point I kind of lose focus with the camera, and it focuses more on the dirt on the window rather than what's outside.
Okay, there's no, when I watched the video, it looked like maybe there was snow or something like that was going by, but it's really rain.
So it is a lot. It's a lot of rain and it's a lot of wind, and it really does become a wall of water. And we're flying at 8,000 to 10,000 feet, and we're always above water, so there's not really debris up at that altitude. What we do find sometimes in the eye of these storms are birds that have gotten caught in the eye and are just flying around in the eye trying to find somewhere to go.
Yeah. This is a dark question, I suppose. Do they find somewhere to go? Do they live through this? Do we know?
I don't know the answer to that question. But especially when we're closer to islands and things like that, we do find birds in the eye sometimes.
We will take the positive tack and say that they all land perfectly safely.
I'm sure they do.
Yeah. So again, you showed this video, and is there a way to contextualize the turbulence that you're going through when you go into this wall compared to like a bumpy commercial flight? Like some of us might have experienced that. Is there any way to compare?
So it's kind of like, I say it's like a wooden roller coaster because there is a lot of vibration from the engines. And there's also kind of being jerked around from side to side and up and down. Sometimes we'll get in a downdraft that will force the aircraft down pretty quickly, and you can lose a couple hundred feet of altitude like that. And part of the reason that we use propeller aircraft to fly through these storms is that propellers can respond to that kind of change very quickly. And so the pilots up front are flying the aircraft, and there's someone called a flight engineer who sits between them, and they're just controlling the throttles. And so if we feel that we're starting to fall, they can increase the throttles to get us back up to altitude, or if we're starting to get taken up too much, they can pull back. And part of that is to reduce stress on the airframe.
Yeah, very cool. All right, a bunch of questions that were really quick follow-ups on that for a bunch of people all at once. So Emily wanted to follow up. Has it ever become so dangerous that you had to leave a hurricane quickly?
Not for me. There are stories from years past of flying through, and this was back in like the 80s when they used to fly through these storms at 1,500 feet above the water. And there are stories about sea salt accretion on the engines, causing some engines to shut down and them having to circle in the eye to climb up and out. We don't do that anymore, so we have a much safer buffer between us and the water. But things can go wrong on these flights, and we prepare a lot for them. We're talking about fires of unknown origin from electronics racks because there's a lot of power flowing into these science instruments on board. We also brief before every flight what we would do in a ditching scenario if we ever had to land the aircraft on the water. Luckily for me, knock on wood, wherever I can find some, I have not been in an emergency situation like that. And we take as many precautions as we can to do this, like I said, as safely as possible above all else.
Yeah. A bunch of deaths around Canada and the US just took a little beating for you. So we're all knocking on wood for you. Fingers crossed. A question we get whenever we deal with storms from Lewis: when hurricane season's getting longer and more intense due to the changing climate, does your workload get crazier every year? Is this something that can you confirm this too, that hurricanes are changing?
I won't speak to that because I'm not on the science side of things. We've certainly seen some active seasons just within the last couple years. 2017 was devastating with hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. 2018 saw Hurricane Michael slam into Florida and some other Gulf states. This last year, Hurricane Dorian devastated the Bahamas. So we are seeing, a lot of dangerous storms, but we've also seen dangerous storms in the past. So I won't speak to that because, again, not really my wheelhouse to talk about that.
All right. You talked about flying over water earlier. So Julianne wants to know, at what point in the hurricane's life cycle do you stop flying over them? If they've made landfall just before, is there a point?
So we'll fly storms for as long as they're threatening people, or as long as they have research value if they're deep out in the Atlantic. And so we'll fly them from when they form as tropical storms all the way up to at the point that they're making landfall. And after that, usually ground-based systems can take over for what we do. So our job is to provide data that we really can't get anywhere else while these storms are over water. But once they get over land, then you've got ground-based radars, you've got other land-based meteorological instruments that can get you the kind of data that you need.
Fantastic. Nick, this has been amazing. And again, I'm going to put your link to your Twitter in the chat bar. Is there another place that people can go to learn more about these storms, about the work that the hurricane hunters do? Like, this is a cool topic.
Hurricanes.gov is sort of where I always direct people to go during hurricane season. If you want information on current or past storms, you can also look at the data that we're collecting on these flights as it comes in. And additionally, if you want to learn more just about hurricane hunting or whatever else, you can just send me a message on Twitter or Instagram or whatever else.
Fantastic. Actually, you know what? Before we wrap up, I love this question. Ruth just sent it in. Do you have a favorite part of your job, Nick?
Well, favorite part I kind of talked about with gaining the perspective and considering things in a broader context. But outside of that, probably getting to go to all of these interesting places. Like the North Slope of Alaska isn't a place that a lot of people go to. And I also get to go to tropical islands like Bermuda and Barbados and St. Croix and Hawaii. And so that has its perks as well.
I bet. Fantastic, Nick. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And again, for anyone tuning in at home, SciComm Storytime every 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Really, really fantastic people. And we really hope you continue to join us as we continue our series for the weeks to come. Nick, this was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. And bye for now, guys.